No. Joining us now is Professor Salvatore Babones. He's an associate professor at the University of Sydney. He's written a book in 2013, Methods for Quantitative Macro-Comparative Research, and currently he's focusing on the political sociology of authoritarianism. But your piece, your opinion piece on the Indian democracy at 75 throws up some very interesting observations, especially with those quote-unquote independent democracy watchers across the world. Right. So what formed the basis of your opinion piece?
Well, my opinion piece is based on a research paper that's been published in Quadrant Magazine and now republished on the print in India. The research paper is an examination of the three major democracy organizations, Freedom House in the United States, the Economic Intelligence Unit in the UK, and the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden. In that research paper, I examine literally all of the reasons they give for India's troubling decline in democracy since 2018, and have found errors, inconsistencies, and I think outright misrepresentations in all of them.
But it feels good to hear somebody who's not an Indian to say the same, because we've been crying out loud and saying we're living 20% of the world's population resides in this landmass, and if he's got to come back, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi and this current disposition came back so strongly, they came back because they had the confidence of the people. And yes, every democracy has its problems, but you also make a comparison of India as a democracy vis-a-vis other democracies and how these inconsistencies appear. So let's go one by one. What did you see was perhaps the overarching inconsistency who are these so-called democracy watchers? Did you find a certain amount of a narrative or perhaps a position that they had actually taken, which was more an opinionated position rather than backed on facts?
All three ranking systems noted a dramatic decline in India's democracy ranking as keyed to the 2019 election, and claiming that democracy had severely deteriorated in India as a result or in line with the 2019 election. But when you actually look at the evidence they give for that, many of the specifics either predate 2014 even, or those specifics have no temporal connection to the 2019 election. But I'm much more concerned about the outright misrepresentations. I mean, for example, if you go into the footnotes of these democracy reports, you find the oft-cited statistic that more journalists are killed in India than in any other country in the world. Now, that's a terrible fact, but that's a terrible fact for a country that has a population of 1.4 billion and a free media. In fact, when you standardize those statistics by population, we find that India has an average of about 3.5 journalist killings per year. That's 3.5 too many. And the rest of the world outside China, for which there's no data, has an average of 6.3 billion per year. So in fact, journalists are safer in India than they are outside India. Now, that should be a positive factor. On top of that, saying that journalists killed doesn't tell us who killed them. Now, again, 3.5 journalists killed is too many under any circumstances, but there was no evidence to suggest that the government or government-linked entities work behind these deaths. There are similar misrepresentations in the UAPA record. Now, as an American, I teach in Australia, but I am an American, and I'm very opposed to emergency legislation of the kind that India has in the UAPA. It's not just India that has it. Canada has it. European Union has it. America does not. However, under the UAPA, there's been roughly a constant level of arrests made every year between 2014, when the data start, and 2021. That number's between 900 and 1,000 per year, roughly. There's no trend. But if you specifically seek to find a trend, you can find individual year pairs for which it goes up, but then the next year it goes down. So if you're intentionally trying to make Indian democracy look bad, you can cite those particular statistics without giving them any context in terms of the Maoist insurgency going on or the Kashmir situation, simply by giving the numbers. If you'll allow me, I can give you one more very striking example. One number that's constantly cited to show that India is no longer a democracy is the number of people who have sedition reports, FIRs, first indication reports, filed against them. And it is routinely reported in the international press as hundreds thousands of people facing sedition charges. Now, of course, those are not charges. Anyone in India pretty much can file an FIR. The question is, are people actually being prosecuted? There seems to be no trend in prosecutions. The prosecutions are much lower in number. But go even deeper into the data, go into the footnotes of the report. You find out that the period over which sedition claims are being made, they say the decade 2010 to 2020. Now, as a quantitative social scientist, that was an immediate red flag for me. A decade, 10 years. That's either 2010 to 2019, if you want to call it the 2010s, or that's 2011 to 2020, if you want to consider it a proper decade. Why did they use specifically the 11 years, 2010 to 2020? Because those are the only period over which you can find a rise in the use of first indication reports of sedition. Choose any other period, and it's a decline. So this kind of thing really makes me call into question the good faith with which these rankings have been compiled.
Did it give you the impression that they were just out to get PM Narendra Modi? They cannot palliate, perhaps people sitting behind and writing these reports cannot palliate that one leader in a nation that has 1.4 billion people can come back stronger and continue to enjoy perhaps a large amount of confidence among the people, even after 8 years in government. Do you believe that, did you have reason to believe when you looked at the facts and the way it was interpreted, that there was a motive to try and show him in poor light?
I don't think these organizations are anti-Modi or anti-BJP, and they're certainly not anti-India. However, these organizations reflect the opinion of the intellectuals, of the experts, of the journalists, of the academics who report back to them. That is, these organizations don't collect their own information. They use information that's out in the public sphere, and they hire academics and journalists to write sections of their reports for them. So a report from one of these organizations may be 250 pages long. The India section is a couple of pages, and that's written on behalf of the organization by somebody. So I suspect what's happened is that these reports on India simply reflect the overall opinion of India's intellectual class, not just India's intellectual class, but the expat or NRI intellectual class who are concerned with Indian matters. Look, a professor at Harvard who studies India, who may be of Indian background, has much more influence on a report like this than an Indian author, in India who is not connected to international organizations. The report reflects the politics of those who are contributing to it, not necessarily any conspiracy by these organizations to downgrade India.
But the responsibility is also on the publisher. It is also on the responsibilities on entities like Freedom House or EIU, that they check the reports and the fallacies that you have noted. The fact of interpretation of data which is selectively convenient to stitch a particular narrative should have been flagged. Or was the brief that make it 2 pages and make India look bad?
I don't think the brief was to make India look bad. I think the brief was, go away and tell me what your expert conclusion is. Unfortunately, so many of the experts allow their own political viewpoints to influence their expert judgments. And that's something that's endemic throughout the social sciences and obviously throughout journalism as well. It takes a very dedicated journalist or social scientist to report something with which she or he disagrees and nonetheless report it straight without doing it grudgingly, without trying to manipulate it. It's very difficult to be an objective vessel for the truth instead of letting your own viewpoint sink in. And really, I think that's what's happened. We simply see the personal prejudices, people using these organizations as tools with which to fight their own domestic political battles.
But then the organization should flag it off, because at the end of the day, who wrote it does not come to the fore. Who's published it or who's issuing it and who's taking ownership for it and who's attaching their name to it stands out. But how is it that the interpretations are common through all the three? So are they writing, or are they their source pool? Is it the same set of interpreters or analysts or journalists?
It's generally speaking the same set or the same class of intellectuals. Look, when you do broad cross-national work like I do, you're dealing with more than 200 countries. You can't possibly be an expert on all 200. Instead, you rely on the opinions of others. Unfortunately, it's those others who are coming to the table with an axe to grind in this case.
So
look,
how do we resolve this?
If I can just, I'm sorry to intrude.
Yeah, please come. Please come.
You can't expect an administrator or a publisher sitting in Washington or London to have expertise in the whole world. Now, when they write about the United States, they're very well aware that intellectuals will overhype things. I mean, the president of the United States himself has said that Republican administered states today are a little better than totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Now, we all know that's not true. We all know he doesn't believe that. But because we all know the United States through its news media, we consume it, we're aware of it, we take that with a grain of salt. I mean, people around the world are not rushing to America to defend democracy against these totalitarian regimes in places like Florida and Texas. But when it comes to a country with which we're not familiar, a country that we haven't studied, inevitably, we simply rely on the advice of people who have Harvard after their name, Stanford after their name, people have New York Times after their name. That credibility allows them to speak in a way without being challenged. And that's really what's happened. The publishers of these three reports challenged those who've come with, frankly, in many cases, manufactured evidence.
So is it because they're driven by a certain perception of India, or this is how they believe India is? Because you make a case that India is also one of the oldest democracies.
Yes.
And perhaps the only democracy which perhaps broke through the shackles of imperialism and has continued to remain a democracy right through, even including the emergency period. You write about it. And you also say that despite the per capita being so low, it's amazing the way we as a nation have thrived with the principles of democracy. Can you elaborate?
People often say that India is the world's largest democracy. From a social science standpoint, that's irrelevant. There's no correlation between population size and democratic quality. The relevant facts are that India is by far the world's poorest, well-institutionalized democracy. When I say things in the press about Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, these are states that have a GDP, gross state product per capita, on an equivalent level with Central Africa. Right. So to see these states maintaining any kind of democracy is an incredible achievement. To see them maintaining a high level of democracy is an extraordinary achievement. That's the first thing. The second thing is India is the only post-colonial state, only major post-colonial state to have remained a democracy throughout its entire period of independence. The only one. Which again is incredible. India has not fallen into the same traps as other post-colonial countries has. And when people say that it's all because of India's British heritage, well, I remind them that Britain did not leave India a democracy, but even more so, if you look at other countries in South Asia that have a similar British heritage, like Bangladesh and Pakistan were both carved out of British India. Myanmar was carved out of British India. Sri Lanka, of course, was under British administration for more than 100 years. When we look at these alternative cases, we can't trace Indian democracy to its British institutions. Really, this is a homegrown democracy that I've come to admire. I've come to be very impressed by. I mean, I've gone back to India's independence documents, the literature around independence, and just been incredibly impressed by the depth of the intellectual effort that went into establishing India's democracy, which I think is the reason India remains a democracy today.
Well, one of the aspects is also civilizationally, this landmass has largely been a democracy, even though there was a king who was always there. So it was a kingdom come with subjects, but welfare was always intrinsic. And to rule for the sake of the people, govern for the sake of people. That was perhaps a principle which was always there. But who are the barbarians at the gate? Let me ask you.
Oh, well, the Barbarians at the Gate was just a clever title for the article. The Barbarians at the Gate, at India Gate, are not the current government of India. They're not the people of India. The Barbarians at the Gate are the Western analysts who are seeking to tear down really one of the world's most successful democracies in the interest of petty partisan political gain.
Well, that's a very strong statement coming from you. An American who's practicing his wares in Australia, and you're also taking on the Western analysts. What do you think is their motivation? Are there entities who want India to have a particular perception or to manage the perception and a narrative against about India? Are they weighing in on them? Is this money? Is this a sociologically influential group? How would you see this? Why would a Western analyst want to do this?
Look, I'd like to dismiss all sorts of conspiracy theories around this. This doesn't come from China, from the American CIA, from secret American funding. This really comes as a genuine expression of people's opinions. Look, all of you and your listeners, your viewers, you're all aware of the opinions of leading Indian intellectuals, especially of leading intellectuals who have positions at universities like Harvard and Stanford. You're aware of their political views. And really, these reports simply reflect, these reports accurately reflect the political viewpoints of many of India's most prominent intellectuals. I blame the reports for not exercising greater editorial care, not being, because India is a special case as the world's largest democracy, that they haven't taken the extra attention to check the sources of those who've contributed to their reports. But that said, I have no reason to believe that anyone who's been behind writing these reports and promoting them doesn't sincerely believe what they are writing. They do sincerely believe what they are writing. I hear from Indian intellectuals and from academic colleagues repeatedly that India is no democracy at all, but is in fact an authoritarian regime. Some say it's a totalitarian regime. I take that with a grain of salt, but I do hear it, and they do really feel it.
Well, because the fact is that in our country, law and order is a state subject. It's not a central subject. It's all the federal states who control their own law and order. So when you break down which state has slapped sedition, which state has actually made these arrests any more union territories. So a proper analyst should actually break it down and say which government, which regime, should we blame it all on the current disposition at the center, or is it all these states which are locally governed? You have chief ministers in state and law and order largely state subject. So that's another counter. But my larger question to you, Professor Salvatore, is how do we change this? How do we correct this? How is it possible that the right story about India is reflected not just via the numbers, but also how those numbers are interpreted in these democracy watchers, in these publishers like Freedom House, EIU, etc.?
I would encourage people to do detailed, dispassionate research. There's no point trying to label these kind of claims about India, label them some kind of anti-India conspiracy or anti-Modi or anti-BJP conspiracy, because anyone who says that will simply be written off as being themselves partisan. The way to do to the numbers, to go to the details, and not to repeat the errors the opposite way, not to try to make India look even better than it is. The answer is simply to produce research that provides an accurate image of India, which you may not always like. There are many all of us have warts, and India, I'm sure, is no exception. But by producing detailed, substantiated research that does not cherry pick, that provides all the data, I think you can change the narrative by making it very clear to those who are in a position to be writing about India, to be speaking about India, to make it very clear to them, look, here are the actual data. Go to the website, find the real data, not just the opinion.
Final two questions. Isn't there some amount of, because you said that these publishing houses also owe India an apology when the democracy is at 75 years. So that means you also believe that outfits like Freedom House, EIU, VDEM, who they're trusting and who's interpreting the numbers for them?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So is there not enough, because you said they owe India an apology. That means you're also putting responsibility on these publishing houses.
Yes. Oh, yes, very much. They should be going back to their numbers, going back to their own footnotes, and they should be uncovering these errors. Now that they've had the errors uncovered for them, yes, I think they should be going back through, re-examining their procedures, issuing an apology and a correction. Look, everybody disagrees, and I have no problem with someone disagreeing with me. I have a problem with the sorts of explicit misrepresentations that I've identified being embedded in these reports. Now, they don't have to necessarily apologize for having an opinion on Indian democracy. Everybody has a right to an opinion, but they should apologize for their errors, that's for sure.
You've done a deep dive on the numbers. So let me ask you, and you're also studying authoritarianism sociologically. Is India an authoritarian state? And do you believe the last 8 or 10 years, especially under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there has been a transformation, and has India democratically improved for its people? The quality of living as a democracy, is it going up, or is it the same?
Authoritarianism is a much misused word. People use it as a generic political insult without tying it to its actual sociological origins. Authoritarianism, fundamentally, as the word suggests, rests on respect for authority. It rests on people being allowed to govern because they're in positions of authority to govern, not because they have an electoral mandate. Classic authoritarianisms relied on appointed leaders who were appointed by the elite in society on a consensus basis, that the broad elitists just agreed that one person should run the country, or run, in some cases, the state of a country, without resorting to an electoral mandate and without robust competition in elections. When we see countries where only one candidate has a legitimate place in the ballot, Vladimir Putin's Russia is a classic authoritarian regime. Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey is a classic authoritarian regime. In India, where the BJP tends to win less than half the vote, where all elections are very, very aggressively contested, I don't think we can in any way call it an authoritarian regime. Now, as for the real accomplishments of India over the last 10 or 20 years in improving living standards, I think that speaks for itself. You can turn to UN data on this, and it's very clear that ordinary Indians are living much better than they have a decade or 2 decades ago, and hopefully that will continue well into the future.
Thank you, Professor Salvatore Babones. Thank you very, very much for your time. And it was indeed a pleasure reading through your paper. I just wish more people realize this, and this cognizance taken of the fact that there is a lot of data that has been selectively interpreted, and the true picture has to be there. Like you said, we all watch, but that mean that we are unhealthy? That's the big question,
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.